this is weak conceptual analysis at best, right? He has, again, Nietzsche has absolutely nothing but disdain for Kant and Rousseau's sort of conceptual assessment. He views this as weakness. He says at the beginning, the very first line of that second paragraph, though, the French Revolution as the continuation of Christianity. And earlier we saw that a lot of this, in the last line of this, he goes, a view of these motives spring from the that is darkened by Christianity. A lot of this problem is because both Rousseau and Kant were informed by Christian ideology. Aspects of Christian ideology found its way into their conceptual analysis. It informed their conceptual analysis. And the point is, for Nietzsche, if your assessment, Kant, Rousseau, right? If your assessment is itself informed by Christianity, then why in the world would I need to look at your assessment? I don't need to look at your assessment, right? Let's go to the source, right? So let's not look at Kant and Rousseau, and let's look at the source. The source is Christianity. With respect to great suffering then, right? And now this is more me than it is Nietzsche, but this is an obvious application of it, and I think it's a very good application of it. With respect to this notion of great suffering, right? Let's not look at the great suffering of the collective masses, and now we're moving towards a more, maybe egalitarian on one end, socialist, communist. No, let's not look at it in terms of that, right? Let's look at it in terms with respect to great suffering. And obviously the great suffering was the suffering wherein the infinite was made manifest finite, right? Wherein the Godhead became man, wherein the infinite died, right? The death of the infinite being is one of the great paradoxes of Christian ethic, right? Christian morality, right? The three in one, not necessarily the contradiction. Well, I mean the contradiction of the three in one, right? The infinite manifest finite, the death of the infinite, all of these concepts, right? The great suffering. So what ends up happening is that, as if you will, this is an application of Nietzsche. I don't want people to be upset with what I'm saying. I'm just trying to do. I would say I'm trying to do my job, but this is not my job because I don't teach Nietzsche in school, so I'm just doing this for free. So don't critique me because I'm just trying to get stuff out into the world. But Jesus Christ suffered a lot, and they talked about how Jesus Christ suffered, and the thorns and the whips and the crucifixion and the piercing of the abdomen and on and on and on and the beating, and I mean it was nothing but suffering. And what ends up happening is that we see that suffering represented as a great suffering. Nietzsche says himself, right? He says himself, one no longer, this is note 94, one no longer knows any other way for the past 500 years than to represent him as the bearer of great, he says not him as far as God, but him as man, other European nihilists, as great sufferer. Right? Why? Because the ultimate reference for great suffering comes from the Christian tradition. Jesus is the greatest representative of a sufferer. And we should all aspire to suffer like he suffered. Suffer the children to come unto me, right? It's sort of like this idea of suffering becomes so infused within the tradition of European history for Nietzsche that all there is suffering. To the point that, and now this is me, this is not Nietzsche, but I think Nietzsche, were he listening to my lecture would agree, it becomes what I'm going to call a deification of suffering, right? D-E-I, sorry. Deification of, right? It becomes the deification of suffering, right? Nihilism, the history of European nihilism culminates in this deification. That's a very important point, right? The history of the movement, remember we're talking about time, right? The history of this movement culminates with this idea that suffering is the ultimate goal. Because what ends up happening, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I could seriously just lecture on this one point for the next hour and a half, but the point is, if you posit suffering as the highest. Now we've done a lot. We've posited, and Nietzsche's talked about truthfulness is the highest moral, goodness is the highest, all these other things. If you posit suffering as the highest moral value, then, and it is that which you aspire for, suffering, then everything that you see in the world is going to be interpreted in terms of suffering. You're going to see suffering in women. You're going to see suffering in slaves, suffering in the poor, suffering in workers, suffering in vice-addicted and sick, and moved into the foreground, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, he sort of lists all the different places that you're going to find suffering, and everyone is going to want to say that my suffering is greater than your suffering. Quick side note, I think this is a profound point, and I think it's a great point. You don't necessarily have to, it doesn't have to be necessarily a critique of Christianity. You can just look at, though for Nietzsche it is, you can just look at the idea of of attempting to posit suffering as the highest moral imperative. What ends up happening, and this is where Dietrich Spivak comes in, is that you have people who are saying, look, my community is subaltern. I'm a subaltern. And she's like, you can say your community is oppressed, but to be subaltern, right, it's and I talked about this in a different series, to be a subaltern and to be oppressor aren't the same thing. And what you end up having now is a competition of who's more oppressed, who's more suffering, right? No, the feminists, the women are suffering more than the men. And then the black feminists years later will say, oh no, well, I'm a feminist, but the white women are suffering less than I am. And then the disabled people will come and say, oh, well, the disabilities, we're suffering more. And everybody's like, no, I'm suffering more, I'm suffering more. And each of those groups have their various, that would make a good visual. I should have drawn that, right? That's a visual just jumped in my head. I'm not going to incorporate it into the notes, but just on a quick aside, right? You have a representative. All right, yeah, I'm going to do this real quick. This just came into my head. I think this is really good. All right, so you have, this is freestyle. We're going to do a little freestyle. You have a whole bunch of community members, right? All these community members are saying that they're oppressed. All of these various, and this is all Nietzsche now. You should see that I'm pulling from Nietzsche from various sections, right? So these are all, this is my sort of level of suffering. As we said before, all of these sufferers, right? These are the sufferers, right? All of these sufferers have various representatives. Obviously, representatives are themselves not suffering, right? And what ends up happening is they're arguing between themselves. The representatives are arguing between themselves about who's suffering the most. Oh no, the working class is suffering more than the impoverished class. Apologize to all my British friends. That was a bad British accent, right? All right, so but you get the idea, right? It's ridiculous, right? So now we have class discourse between representatives. Right? And the representatives who are themselves not suffering are arguing about the suffering of those that they represent. I mean, how bizarre a system is this, right? How ridiculous is a system is this? And Nietzsche's just like, I can understand, as a scholar, I would just be fed up. I would be fed up. And one thing that's really, really a key hallmark sign of a great theorist is not that you're just giving social commentaries that the government sucks, this age sucks, da-da-da, but you can see where we've entered complete confusion and contradiction and a complete sort of ridiculous waste of time being spent on non sequitur after non sequitur. He sees within his time, in his era, that all that's being done is discourse on suffering. Everybody's suffering, right? And we have all these different groups of suffering. And we have all these different groups of individuals who represent those groups of suffering. And they're debating against each other as to who's suffering more, right? And Nietzsche's like, well, what's the point of all of this, right? Where did all this come from, right? Where did all this absolutely, and not meaningless, I don't think Nietzsche would say it's necessarily meaningless. He knows where the meaning is. He would say, where is this all coming from? Where's the meaning of this situated? And what he's saying is that the meaning of all of this problem, all of this anger, all of this disappointment and discouragement is rooted in Christianity, right? It's all Christianity's fault, right? And I think I can say that sort of categorically, right? it's all Christianity's fault, because if you tie